Hey everybody, Matt here with the Eyewall and an update on Hurricane Idalia for Tuesday evening. It is about 7:45 Eastern Time, and here is a look at Idalia on satellite. You can see Florida right over here, the Big Bend of Florida where it's expected to come in to make landfalls right over here into Appalachia Bay, Tallahassee up this way. Idalia is generally moving off to the north, so it'll be moving in that general direction. You can see it's trying to pop an eye here. It's getting there. It's definitely well organized. It's definitely not hurting too much. It's just not quite off to the races yet, but it has been steadily strengthening all day today. Winds up to 100 miles an hour now as it's coming to the north. And you can see the forecast track of Idalia right here from the National Hurricane Center, bringing it into the Big Bend area, Appalachia Bay, moving it to the west of about Lake City, and then up into South Georgia near Valdosta, across Waycross, Georgia, into South Carolina, just north of Savannah, Georgia, just north of Hilton Head, and moving offshore somewhere between probably Myrtle Beach and Charleston, depending on the exact angle it takes. But it'll come offshore somewhere off the North or South Carolina coast by the time we get into Thursday. But this will make landfall probably tomorrow around mid-morning. That's when conditions should be at their worst in the Florida Panhandle. We'll talk more about winds and surge and all the other things here as we go, but this is a general track. Getting a lot of questions from people about this, which is as Idalia goes off the East Coast, some models are showing it kind of drifting back to the south and then trying to come back toward Florida. That's not unheard of. That has happened in the past with some other storms, most notably Hurricane Ivan back earlier in the 2000s. But typically the second act of these storms is not quite as robust as the first act. So if that does happen, we wouldn't necessarily expect a big storm to come this way. So I would tell people not to worry about that. Really, that's just kind of noise at this point. And if that were to even happen, we're talking a week to 8-9 days away. So a long way off until that happens. Let's just focus on what's at hand right now, which is the impacts to Florida. This is the peak storm surge forecast from the National Hurricane Center's 5 o'clock Eastern Time advisory, and you can see anywhere in the purple, that's where we're expecting about 10 to 15 feet of storm surge. That's water above ground level, perhaps as much as 10 to 15 feet of that. That is a lot of water. That is not survivable type water. The National Hurricane Center used the word catastrophic to describe the storm surge. You may say, okay, that's just another word. They take a very, very serious deliberation to use that word. It takes a lot for them to bust out the word catastrophic. When they use that, you know they're serious. And in this case, we are going to be talking about a catastrophic type storm surge in the Big Bend. Some people will say it is sparsely populated there, which it is, which is certainly better news than say if it were coming into Tampa or something like that. But there are still communities here, small communities populated all along this part of the coast, and they will be severely impacted and tested, and they're going to need help after the storm. So something to just keep in mind. The highest surge will be just to the right of where the eye comes ashore. So there's still a little bit of uncertainty exactly as to how that's going to happen, whether it's in the Big Bend, in the central part of Appalachia Bay, closer to Apalachicola. We don't exactly know where that's going to happen for sure. A little wobble can make a difference. But either way, anywhere on Appalachia Bay or in the Big Bend needs to be ready for catastrophic storm surge as we go into tomorrow morning. Elsewhere down the coast, we will see some significant surge into the Tampa area as well, 4 to 7 feet. That will cause flooding in low-lying areas. Heed local officials' advice and evacuation orders in those areas. Further down the southwest coast, we've seen some flooding today in parts of Fort Myers and Naples. That should gradually start to subside as we go into tomorrow. And the storm surge will gradually trim back the risk as Idalia goes to the north. On the east coast, minor surge in the Jacksonville area, a little bit more surge, possibly some moderate type flooding in Savannah, Georgia, moderate to major type flooding, coastal flooding in the Charleston area, which we'll talk about now. Here's a forecast tide gauge at Charleston Harbor. You can see we've got some moderate flooding occurring this evening. That will be a little bit less tomorrow morning, but then tomorrow evening's high tide cycle in Charleston, which is a pretty flood-prone place as it is, gets up close to major flooding, if not into the lower end of major flooding. So certainly some inconvenience along the South Carolina coast as well as the Georgia coast as we go into tomorrow evening, Wednesday evening's high tide cycle for parts of those areas. Here's a look at what we call an inundation map, potential storm surge flooding. This is displaying flooding values that are the height of water that you could see that only has about a 10% chance of being exceeded. So consider this sort of like the worst case scenario. The most reasonable worst case scenario for storm surge flooding. There's obviously a small chance it could be exceeded, but in general, you're looking at the Big Bend coast here, And anywhere you see the red, that could be as much as 8 to 9 feet of water above ground. And that goes inland too, pretty far, several miles inland. So this storm surge is going to be very, very, very serious in the Big Bend of Florida. Folks, I really hope have taken this seriously. There's occasionally an aura of, well, we've been through this before. They've had a few minor hurricanes. We have never seen a hurricane in the modern era of this intensity forecast to go into this part of Florida. The Big Bend typically has dodged bullets over the years from some of these bigger storms, and this time it looks like that luck is going to run out, unfortunately. So folks in those areas, I really hope got out or are prepared to have a very, very bad morning tomorrow morning. Please, if you know anybody in that area, try to reach them, make sure they are in a safe place, and make sure they get help if they need it. In terms of wind, we have been talking about storm surge a lot, but wind will also be a big deal. And we're particularly watching the Tallahassee area. So this is from this morning's GFS model, bringing the storm in right about here into the central part of Appalachia Bay. That would put Tallahassee very close to the western edge of the eye wall. The eye wall on a hurricane has the strongest winds. So a couple of wobbles one way or the other could make or break whether Tallahassee sees extremely strong winds from the eye wall or just more generic hurricane force gusts. Certainly some damage, some power outages expected in Tallahassee regardless, but whether it goes from that or to something worse depends on the exact track of this storm. So that's another thing we're going to be watching through the night tonight. Tallahassee kind of on the western edge of this. Also, as you go up into South Georgia, Valdosta is probably going to have a bad morning tomorrow morning with some very strong winds as this comes inland, particularly with the forward speed that Idalia has. It's not going to be moving very slowly, so it's going to take a little bit of time to unwind once it goes inland. So you will have some hurricane force winds, I think, well into South Georgia. Maybe not as severe as we saw during Hurricane Michael in some parts of South Georgia, but into the Valdosta area could be pretty rough tomorrow morning as this moves inland. Areas to the east may fare okay. Lake City will be right on the edge of hurricane force winds, but again, if this comes in a little further east than what's expected here, then Lake City gets into some of it as well. So areas we'll be watching down there in South Georgia and the Florida Panhandle and parts of the inland parts of northern Florida as well. Last but not least, the rain. We're still expecting a lot of it along the path of Idalia as it comes inland from Tallahassee up into South Georgia through Augusta, southeastern parts of South Carolina, from about Columbia down to just near the coast. We will see anywhere from 6 to 8, 9, 10 inches of rain perhaps. Also some heavy rain up in North Carolina, starting to see some signals for some heavier rain near Cape Hatteras and in some of the sounds. And we could also see some flooding in some of the sounds and so on the eastern parts of North Carolina. So you could deal with some flooding on the Outer Banks. Winds will be generally from the east to the west on the north side of Idalia's circulation. So we could see flooding on the Outer Banks and flooding on the mainland side of Pamlico and Albemarle Sound in North Carolina, along with some of this heavy rain. The heavy rain will actually exacerbate some of the coastal flooding because it won't allow water to drain. So even down here in Florida, where we're going to see storm surge, will be adding 5, 6, 7 inches of rain by that point on top of it, and that will exacerbate some of that storm surge flooding. So areas that will get underwater with surge will stay underwater for a while as the storm kind of moves through. So all in all, not a great situation. Obviously, with a landfalling tropical system, you also have to talk about tornadoes. There will be a chance of tornadoes across Florida and southeast Georgia into South Carolina as Idalia comes to the north. We've already seen a couple reports of tornadoes today in parts of South Florida as well, with some of the feeder bands coming onshore from Idalia. So all in all, a whole slew of issues to deal with over the next 24 to 36 hours as Idalia moves to the north into Florida, Georgia, and eventually South Carolina, and hopefully out to sea. Visit our website, theiwall.com, for more. We have a late afternoon update. We'll also be updating it again tonight before midnight with some of the latest information that we get from the National Hurricane Center. You can check that out as well and follow us elsewhere on social media. We'll be updating throughout the storm. Please stay safe and have a good evening.